After the fall, I lay there helpless and watched my son, Mark, drain the $1.8 million I'd spent a lifetime earning. He took the watch my wife gave me. Then he whispered that he would leave me to die alone in a nursing home. What he didn't know is that an old librarian always knows how to turn to the final page. Have you ever trusted someone so much that you would give them all of your possessions without a second thought? I have. Hello, everyone. My name is Arthur Miller. Thank you for being here. If you're listening, please give me a like and let me know where you're coming from in the comments. I'd love to see how far our story goes. Before the fall, my mornings always began the same way, with the smell of old paper and the respectful silence of my study. It wasn't just a room. It was my sanctuary. Every leather-bound book, every Parker fountain pen, things that had been with me through 40 years as a librarian, they all told a story. I loved the order of it all. The way each book had its precise place on the shelf, just as I believed every event in life had its reason. I'd built a legacy of knowledge, and this house, with patience and meticulous care. This was the world I had made for myself, a world that made sense. I taught my son, Mark, in that very room. I taught him how to read, how to appreciate a well-told story, and how to find information to stand on his own 2 feet. I truly thought I'd given him a sturdy compass for life. I believed that a man who understood the value of knowledge, of order, could never truly lose his way. I was wrong. It happened in such a foolish way, as most of life's great turning points do. A single step, slick with the dew of an overnight rain. I don't remember the moment of falling, only the feeling that came after. A sharp, blinding pain in my hip, and then the quiet humiliation of lying there, helpless, unable to get back up on my own. The independence I had spent a lifetime building vanished in that instant. The hospital became my new world, a world of stark white ceilings and the steady, indifferent beep of machines. Everything smelled of antiseptic, a clean but soulless scent that seemed to erase any trace of the person you were before you arrived. Nurses moved me as if I were an object, a piece of furniture to be adjusted. It was there I realized, for the first time in my 68 years, that I was completely dependent on others. My body, a reliable machine for nearly 7 decades, had betrayed me. And in that profound weakness, I yearned for a familiar face more than anything. Mark appeared through the fog of painkillers, his figure a welcome blur. His presence felt like a lifeline. I remember his voice, soft and full of concern, murmuring something about papers. "Just a few things to sign," he said, "to handle the hospital bills, to make sure everything ran smoothly so I could rest without a worry." He held out a pen. My own hand trembled so much I could barely grasp it, and my eyes couldn't focus on a single word on the page before me. It was all just a hazy smear of black and white. But this was my son. This was the boy I used to read to every single night until he fell asleep. I trusted him. Of course, I trusted him. My signature was a shaky, crooked thing, a faint trace of the man I was in that moment. And just like that, I handed him everything. I gave him my whole world on that piece of paper without a single doubt. Coming home was strange. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Everything was in its place, the books on their shelves, the chairs in their spots, but the air itself felt different. My lazy boy recliner, my old command center where I'd read thousands of books and charted the course of my life, now felt foreign beneath me. Mark was attentive, almost too attentive. There was a subtle tension in his gestures, a carefulness that felt rehearsed. It was like he was playing a part. He moved through my home not like a son visiting his ailing father, but like a new owner surveying his territory. A cold, quiet unease began to creep into my thoughts. I tried to push it away, telling myself I was just being sensitive after the trauma, that the drugs were making me paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It stayed, an unwelcome guest in my own home. The first tangible shape of my suspicion was an enormous television, an 8K flat screen that took up half the living room wall. Mark called it a get-well-soon gift. It was too big, too bright, a loud intrusion into the quiet peace of the room I had so carefully cultivated. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was in a bright red envelope from the health insurance company my late wife and I had faithfully paid into for 30 years, a final notice. The policy was being canceled for non-payment. I sat there for hours, the remote for the garish television in one hand, the thin, flimsy letter that held the weight of my life in the other. I had spent my entire adult life balancing checkbooks, ensuring every bill was paid, every contingency planned for. And now I stared at the impossible math before me, a needless luxury I never asked for, and an essential protection, my very safety net, being stripped away. The equation just didn't add up. They say family is the safest harbor, but when it comes to making critical financial decisions, who do you trust the most? Your children, a trusted professional, or do you always need to keep control in your own hands? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd be interested to know. I held up the red letter when he came back into the room. My voice was quiet. I didn't want to accuse him. I just wanted to understand. "Mark," I started. "What is this?" He snatched the paper from my hand and crumpled it into a tight ball as if it were a personal enemy. His voice was suddenly harsh. He blamed the bank, a mail mix-up, then turned on me, his words sharp, accusing me of always doubting him, of never trusting him. I tried to push myself up from the chair, my body aching, just to tell him I was only worried. As I rose, he shoved me. It wasn't a careless nudge. He pushed me hard, forcing me back down into the depths of the recliner. The pain from my surgical incision flared, a hot, searing line across my hip. But the pain in my chest was worse. It was a clean, sharp break. In that moment, seeing the anger in his eyes, I understood. This wasn't help anymore. A man's legacy isn't just about money. It's about the decades of wise decisions, the patience, the foresight that the money represents. The mail started to bring bank statements, and the simple act of opening them, once a quiet ritual of reassurance, became a source of dread. My routine had always been the same: a cup of black coffee, my reading glasses, and the satisfying rustle of paper that confirmed the world was still in order. Now, my hands would shake as I tore open the envelopes, the names I knew, the companies that were the bedrock of my life savings, sturdy, reliable names like Florida Power and Light and AT&T, stocks I'd bought on the belief that you invest in things that people will always need. They were vanishing. In their place were cold, sterile words: liquidation. That word was followed by staggering numbers that didn't seem real. $150,000 here, $200,000 there. The proceeds were funneled into vague, hollow notes. Real estate investment, portfolio restructuring. They were words meant to sound important, but they felt like a smokescreen. I would just sit there in the suffocating silence of my own living room, watching a lifetime of careful planning being shredded, piece by piece, on those thin pages. My house of bricks was being replaced by a house of cards, and I could feel a phantom wind beginning to blow. But some things are worth more than any stock. The Omega Seamaster watch my wife Eleanor had given me for our 25th anniversary was one of them. She'd saved for a year to buy it. I remember the look on her face when I opened the box, a mixture of pride and nervous hope that I'd like it. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was our time, encapsulated in stainless steel and a steady ticking heart. I could still feel the warmth of her hand on my wrist when I wore it. It always rested in its polished oak box on my nightstand. One morning, I reached for it, a small habit of connection to her. I opened the lid. The velvet interior was empty. For a second, my heart simply stopped beating. The silence in the room was absolute. I called for Mark, my voice strained, trying my best to keep it even. He answered from the kitchen, not even bothering to look at me as he poured himself a coffee. He said he'd taken it for servicing, a professional cleaning. He said I'd let it gather dust for too long. The lie was so effortless, so casually cruel. It was colder and more brutal than the shove had been. He hadn't just taken an object. He was trying to take a memory. He was trying to erase her. I'm sure in your home there's an object that isn't worth much money but is priceless to you. Maybe it's an old tool from your father or a gift from your spouse. What is it, and what's the story behind it? Please tell us in the comments below. My friend Dave from the VFW Club was my last real link to the outside world. He was the only one left I could really talk to. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. I heard his loud, cheerful voice through the door. "Hey, just dropping by to see Artie." I started to get up, my hip protesting, but Mark was already there, blocking the way. I heard my son's voice, thick with a false practice sadness. He told Dave the doctor had ordered absolute rest, no visitors, no excitement. I sat there, frozen, just a few feet from the door, listening to the sound of my best friend's footsteps retreating down the walkway. It was then I understood. Mark wasn't just controlling my money. He was controlling my world. He was building invisible walls around me, brick by invisible brick, and I was too weak to tear them down. I had to get to the bank. I had to talk to someone face to face. It was the only way. I reached for the old landline on the end table to call a taxi. Before I could dial, Mark's hand was on the receiver, gently placing it back in its cradle. "I'll take you, Dad," he said with that empty smile. But then the car had a flat tire that needed fixing. The next day, he had an urgent meeting he couldn't miss. The excuses piled up until the bank was closed for the weekend. That night, after he'd gone out, I went to the phone again. There was no dial tone, just dead silence. I followed the cord with my hand down behind the bookshelf. It was unplugged from the wall, the jack tucked carefully out of sight. It was such a small, simple act, but so profoundly vicious. He had cut my last line to the world. I was no longer just a patient in my own home. I was a prisoner on a deserted island. I thought at the very least, I still had the house, my final sanctuary, paid off long ago. But then another official-looking letter came, this time from a mortgage company with a slick, modern name. Mark dismissed it as a simple refinancing to lower taxes. But I am a librarian. My life's work was to read and to understand the words on a page. I put on my strongest reading glasses and went over the fine print line by painful line. And there they were, two words that made my blood run cold. Reverse mortgage. I knew what it meant. He had taken the bricks and mortar, the sweat and sacrifice of my entire life, and turned it into a line of credit. He had sold the future of my home for cash today. The roof over my head was no longer my own. I had to confront him. I gathered the papers and waited for him in the living room. I just wanted an explanation. I needed to hear him make it make sense. But when I asked, holding out the documents, he didn't offer excuses. He backed me into a corner of the room. His hand clamped down on my shoulder, and the pain from my hip surgery shot through me like a hot poker. He leaned in close, his face just inches from mine. His voice wasn't loud. It was a whisper, a cold, venomous hiss that slid directly into my ear. He told me he would turn me into a ghost. He would tell the courts I was senile, that my mind was gone. He said he'd put me in a place where they'd forget my name, a place where I would be tied to a bed and left to die in silence. In that moment, he was no longer my son. He was my jailer, and he had just shown me the bars of my cage. I had almost given up. I truly had. My son's whispered words had become the bars of my cage, an invisible prison built from fear. His threat echoed in the quiet rooms of my house, a verdict that had already been delivered. The days blurred into one another, each one a copy of the last. I'd just sit in my recliner, the world outside my window looking like a movie I was no longer a part of. The fight had gone out of me, replaced by a heavy gray resignation. I was just waiting for the end. But then, one afternoon, a sound I hadn't heard in months broke the silence. It was a tinny, unfamiliar ringtone. The old cheap smartphone my granddaughter had given me for Christmas was vibrating on the end table, an unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it. What was the point? But something made me reach for it. My voice was a dry rasp from disuse when I answered. Hello? Mr. Miller? Hi, this is Maria from the bank. Maria. The name took a moment to register. Then I saw her face in my mind's eye. The warm, genuine smile, the patient way she had explained statements to Eleanor and me for over 15 years. Her voice. It was like a rope being thrown down a deep, dark well. It was a sound from the world I thought I had lost forever, a world of friendly faces and simple, decent transactions. It was a connection. Her voice was hesitant at first, professional, but with an undercurrent of something else. She said she was just calling to confirm a large transfer she'd received instructions for via email, a routine security check. She'd tried the house line first, she explained, but someone else had answered and the voice didn't sound quite like mine. She said she could have just let it go, written it off as me having a bad cold. But she didn't. It was the intuition of a good person, a person who had known my wife and me long enough to notice the smallest dissonance, a person who remembered how Eleanor always brought her a box of homemade cookies at Christmas. Is everything all right, Mr. Miller? That simple question. It wasn't just procedural, it was human. It was full of genuine concern. And in that one moment, a stranger, a kind woman doing her job, gave me the one thing my own son had stolen from me: validation. The feeling that I wasn't crazy, that my fears were real. Her question held an entire world of meaning. It told me I wasn't invisible. Maria's call lit a tiny pilot light inside me. It was fragile, but it was there. It was enough to make me move, to make me start searching. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe just something to hold on to, a piece of evidence that my life was still, in some small way, my own. I made my way up to the attic, the air thick with the dust of forgotten years. I rummaged through old boxes, through stacks of my wife's letters and my old service medals. I found a box of Mark's things from high school: textbooks, yearbooks, a deflated football. Inside an old world history textbook, a folded piece of paper fell out. It wasn't a bank statement. The paper was cheap, the letterhead aggressive. It was a demand letter from a loan shark. The number made me feel dizzy. $250,000. And at the bottom, a scrawled, handwritten note: "You have 1 week." Suddenly, everything clicked into place with a sickening thud. The giant TV, the sold stocks, the reverse mortgage, the desperate, hunted look I'd seen in his eyes, the escalating cruelty. My son wasn't a monster born of pure evil. He was a coward, cornered and terrified. He was in a hole so deep he was willing to pull his own father down with him to try and climb out. That truth didn't lessen the pain of his betrayal, but it burned away the last of my illusions. I saw him clearly for the first time. This wasn't just about greed anymore. This was about his survival and mine. It was a fight to see who would break first. And I, a retired librarian with a bad hip, decided in that dusty attic that it would not be me. Sometimes, understanding the reason behind someone's actions is more painful than the actions themselves. It doesn't excuse them, but it makes everything more complicated. Have you ever discovered a terrible truth that explained someone's awful behavior? How did it change the way you saw them? I felt completely outmatched. I couldn't overpower him physically. I couldn't reason with his threats. My eyes fell on the old smartphone again, still lying on the table. My granddaughter had installed a voice recording app on it. "For you to record your old stories, Grandpa," she'd said with a smile. I'd never even opened it. But now, an idea, sharp and clear, cut through the fog in my mind. I couldn't be a soldier in this fight. I couldn't meet his force with force. But maybe I could be a librarian. I could be a listener, a chronicler. I could use his own words, his own rage against him. I could use the silence of this house and a little piece of technology my granddaughter taught me how to use. It wasn't a plan, not really. It was just a flicker of hope. That evening, I settled into my recliner, tilting my head back and letting my mouth fall open slightly, pretending to doze off. It wasn't hard to fake the exhaustion. I felt it in my bones. The smartphone was placed carefully on the small table beside me, partially hidden behind a stack of Civil War histories. The recording app was on. I waited until I heard him moving around in the kitchen, and then I began to mumble, letting my voice drift as if in a dream. I called out my late wife's name. "Eleanor, what about the savings, Eleanor? Our savings. Mark, where did you put it, son?" I waited. In the heavy darkness of the living room, punctuated only by the solemn tick-tock of the grandfather clock, I heard his footsteps stop. Then I heard them turn and start moving toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence of the night. He moved closer. The floorboards in the old house were silent under his weight. As he leaned over me, I could smell the faint, sour scent of whiskey on his breath. He thought I was deep in sleep, a rambling old man lost in a dream. He couldn't see that behind my closed eyelids, I was more awake than I had ever been. My entire being was focused, narrowed down to a single point of listening. His voice, when it came, was a low whisper, thick with a contempt he no longer bothered to hide. It was a voice meant only for what he believed were my deaf, sleeping ears. "That money's mine now, old man," he breathed into the darkness. "It's saving my life. And you are never, ever going to see it again." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. He spoke of my life savings, the money Eleanor and I had so carefully put away, as if it were a trivial thing he was entitled to. He confessed his theft and his intentions without a flicker of remorse. But a strange thing happened as I lay there, feigning sleep. The words didn't hurt me. The sharp, familiar sting of betrayal was gone. In its place, a profound and icy calm settled over me. It was the calm of absolute certainty. I had what I needed. The small, silent phone on the table, my quiet little witness, had captured it all. He had just handed me the truth, pure and undeniable. In his arrogance, my son had just condemned himself. He had no idea that in that single venomous whisper, he had given me the only bullet I would need for the fight ahead. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the deep shadows of the living room, long after he had gone to bed, the phone clutched in my hand like a precious stone. The house was still, except for the steady rhythm of the grandfather clock counting off the seconds of my new reality. Over and over, I played the recording, pressing the phone to my ear. I didn't listen to feel the pain. I listened to be sure. I listened to burn every syllable, every cruel inflection into my memory. His voice, captured in the digital ether, was so clear, so pitiless. It was the truth, a terrible, unvarnished truth, and as I listened, the fear that had been my constant companion for weeks began to recede, dissolving like mist in the face of this cold, hard fact. It was replaced by something solid, something unyielding: resolve. My entire life as a librarian, I had dealt in facts, in evidence, in the orderly progression of stories from beginning to end. Every story has an ending. I knew, sitting there in the dark, that I would be the one to write the final chapter of this one, not with anger, not with a thirst for revenge, but with the simple, irrefutable weight of the truth. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt as though I'd been born again, forged anew with a singular, unshakable purpose. I was up before Mark that morning. I moved slowly, my hip aching with each deliberate step, but my mind was a place of perfect clarity. I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I went to my study and took out my collection of Parker fountain pens from their mahogany case. One by one, I began to clean them. I unscrewed the barrels, flushed the old ink from the nibs, and polished the casings with a soft, clean cloth. I could feel the cool, reassuring weight of the metal in my hands, see the gleam return to their surfaces. It was a small act, a ritual from a life that felt a lifetime away. But today, it meant something different. This wasn't nostalgia. This was preparation. It was the quiet, methodical ritual of a soldier cleaning his rifle before a battle. I was restoring order to my world, starting with the smallest things before I faced the greatest storm. I had the proof, but it was useless if it remained locked away in this house with me. It was a key with no door. I needed a plan to get it out. I began to watch Mark, not as a father, but as a warden. I studied his routines. I noted the way he always left around 10 in the morning, like clockwork, to get coffee and a newspaper from the corner store. It was a small window, 15 minutes at most, but it was the only one I had. The house phone was still dead, and I couldn't walk far on my own. My gaze drifted out the front window to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It looked 100 miles away. An idea began to form in my mind. It was risky. It was a gamble that depended on timing, luck, and the kindness of others. But it was all I had. Sometimes, to get our spirit back, we do the most ordinary things: clean the house, fix something broken, or just take a walk. What's the one simple activity that makes you feel most in control when life gets chaotic? Share your own rituals below. My plan required two things: a way to back up the recording and a way to send it. That afternoon, while Mark was out on a longer errand, I sat down at my old desktop computer. My hands fumbled with the modern technology, but my mind was sharp. I carefully transferred the audio file from the phone to a tiny USB drive, the kind people use for keychains. A small, insignificant object to hold such a terrible secret. Then I wrote a short, urgent letter to my friend Dave. I didn't dare go into the details. I just wrote that I was in trouble, that my life could be in danger, and that the proof of it was on this drive. I asked him to please take it immediately to Maria at the bank. I sealed the letter and the USB drive in a small envelope, affixed a stamp, and tucked it deep beneath the cushion of my recliner. Now, all I could do was wait for my 15-minute window. The next morning, my entire world had shrunk to the space between the ticks of the grandfather clock. I sat in my recliner, pretending to read the newspaper, but my ears were trained on Mark's movements. I listened to the clink of his coffee cup, the rustle of his jacket, and then, finally, the sound I was waiting for, the jingle of his car keys. "Going to grab a coffee," he called out, his voice already distant. The front door clicked shut. The engine turned over. The sound of his car faded down the street. My stopwatch started. 15 minutes. My heart began to pound, a heavy, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I pushed myself up from the chair, a wave of pain from my hip reminding me to be careful, to be slow, when all I wanted to do was run. I retrieved the small envelope from beneath the cushion. It felt impossibly light in my trembling hand, a flimsy vessel for my last and only hope. I shuffled to the front door. Every step was a negotiation with pain, not just the physical ache, but the gnawing fear that he would come back early, that he'd forgotten his wallet, that this whole plan was a fool's errand. I turned the doorknob and opened the door. The rush of cool morning air felt like a luxury I hadn't experienced in months. It smelled of damp earth and freedom. But as I looked out, the driveway seemed to stretch on for a mile. The mailbox, my sole objective, had never looked so far away. The race began. I clung to the wall of the house for support, then to the wooden railing of the porch, my knuckles white. One step at a time. The flagstones of the walkway were uneven under my slippers, a treacherous landscape I had to navigate. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look down the road for the dreaded sight of his car returning. I focused on the little red flag on the side of the mailbox. It was my lighthouse in the storm, the one point of stability in a world that had turned upside down. The wind rustled the leaves in the big oak tree by the road. In my heightened state of anxiety, the sound was distorted, morphing into the whisper of tires on asphalt, the rumble of an approaching engine. My whole body tensed. Was that him? I forced myself to keep moving, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Just get there, I told myself. Just drop the letter inside. That's all you have to do. Then everything can change. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my fingers touched the cold, sun-bleached metal of the mailbox. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely get a grip on the small handle. With a surge of adrenaline, I pulled it open. The metallic creak of the hinge sounded as loud as a gunshot in the quiet morning air. I dropped the envelope inside. It landed at the bottom of the dark, hollow box with a soft, insignificant thump. It was done. I had done it. I had sent my message in a bottle out into the world. I leaned against the sturdy post for a moment, gasping for air. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, but it was followed immediately by a fresh surge of terror. The clock was still ticking. I had to get back inside. Now. The return journey was 1,000 times worse. Every second that passed felt like a minute, stretching the odds of my discovery. With each step, the image of him pulling into the driveway and finding me out here, exposed and guilty, flashed in my mind. I tried to move faster, but my hips screamed in protest. The pain was a hot, sharp poker, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. Then I heard it. A real car this time, its engine humming at the far end of the street. Was it him? Panic seized me. I abandoned all caution and lunged for the front porch, dragging my rebellious leg behind me. I fumbled with the door, my trembling hands making the simple act of turning a knob feel like cracking a safe. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut just as I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. I collapsed into the nearest armchair, my chest heaving, just as the key slid into the lock. Mark walked in, holding his coffee and the morning paper, the picture of normalcy. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing? You're all out of breath." I fought to steady my voice, to push the words out past the frantic beating of my heart. "Just trying to walk a little," I panted, forcing a weak smile. The doctor said I need to move around. The lie, thin as it was, seemed to work. He shrugged, his attention already shifting to the headlines on the paper. Well, don't overdo it, he said dismissively, and walked into the kitchen. I sat there, perfectly still, as the adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving me weak and trembling. Cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I'd succeeded. My message was on its way. But in that moment, I understood the terrifying nature of the game I was now playing. If Dave didn't get that letter, if the mail was lost, if Mark found it first, it would all be over. There would be no more chances. The days that followed were a special kind of torture, a quiet, agonizing suspense. I didn't know if the letter had reached Dave. I didn't know if he would believe me or if he would think it was just the ramblings of a sick old man. Each day around noon, I would listen for the mail carrier's truck. Mark was always the one to get the mail. I would watch him from my chair, holding my breath as he sifted through the envelopes. My heart would stop every time he paused on a piece of mail, his brow furrowed in thought. The silence in the house grew heavier, thicker. We lived under the same roof, two strangers separated by a vast chasm of lies and suspicion. The house itself seemed to hold its breath along with me. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren was a potential sign, a potential threat. My life had become a silent, agonizing vigil. All I could do was sit and wait and pray that my desperate gamble, sent out into the world on a slip of paper, would not be in vain. In the days that followed my walk to the mailbox, a subtle but distinct shift occurred in the atmosphere of the house. The oppressive quiet remained, but it was now laced with a new kind of tension. I saw the change in Mark first. His confident, almost arrogant demeanor began to fray at the edges. The smugness was replaced by a restless, nervous energy. He became irritable, snapping at me for the slightest things, the volume on the television, the way I stirred my tea. He paced the living room for hours, his footsteps a frantic, repetitive rhythm on the old hardwood floors. His eyes were constantly fixed on his phone, scrolling, waiting, as if anticipating a message that he dreaded receiving. I guessed that his lenders, the loan sharks from that piece of paper, were closing in on him. Their patience was likely wearing thin. But I also allowed myself to believe something else. Perhaps in some deep, instinctual part of his mind, he could feel a change in the currents, a threat he couldn't see, a pressure building from a source he couldn't identify. Every agitated gesture, every curse he muttered under his breath became a small, secret confirmation for me. His anxiety was the first faint ripple from the stone I had cast into the water, and it gave me a sliver of hope. Then came the phone call. It was evening, and the long shadows of twilight were stretching across the room, making the familiar space feel alien. His phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound that made him jump. He glanced at the screen, and I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes before he hurried out onto the back porch to take the call, sliding the glass door shut behind him. I couldn't hear the words, only the agitated cadence of his voice. I watched his silhouette pace back and forth against the darkening sky, a frantic shadow dance. I saw him run his hands through his hair, his shoulders hunched. The call went on for a long, long time. When he finally came back inside, his face was pale, almost ashen. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just stormed past me and went upstairs. Later that night, long after I was supposed to be asleep, I heard sounds from my study. The distinct, unmistakable noise of drawers being pulled open, of papers being shuffled and slammed down. He was searching for something. The sound sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Had he been warned? Had Dave and Maria already made their move? In that moment, fear and hope were locked in a brutal struggle inside my chest, and I didn't know which one would win. From that night on, his surveillance intensified. The pretense of caring for me was dropped entirely, replaced by the stark reality of being a prisoner under the watchful eye of his jailer. He never left my side. If I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, he would follow, leaning against the counter, watching me. When I sat in my recliner to read, he would take the opposite chair, not speaking, just observing me over the top of a magazine. The silence between us was thick with suspicion, a palpable thing that I could almost taste in the air. I knew what he was doing. He was trying to figure out what I had done, trying to find the source of the new pressure he was feeling, and I, in turn, had to perform the most difficult role of my life. I had to become the harmless, slightly senile old man he wanted me to be. I had to let my gaze be vacant, my hands trembled just so. I had to hide every thought, every flicker of fear or hope behind a blank, placid mask. Inside, I was a coiled spring, counting every minute, every hour, waiting for something, anything, to break the unbearable tension. The strain of it all began to wear on my mind. My sleep was plagued by nightmares. One night I dreamed I was trapped in a room with no doors, the walls built from the torn, shredded pages of my favorite books. My life's work, the knowledge I had cherished, was my prison. And Mark was on the outside, his face pressed against a small window, laughing at me, at my helplessness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, the lines between the nightmare and my reality blurring dangerously. The physical confinement was beginning to erode my spirit. How much longer could I endure this? I asked myself. Would help arrive before I truly lost my mind? Waiting is one of the hardest things a person can do. Have you ever had to wait for a piece of news that could change your life? A call from a doctor, a letter from a university, or a reply from a loved one? What did you do to get through that stressful time? Then, one morning, a lifeline. Mark was in the shower, the sound of the water a temporary shield. I heard a faint buzz from my pocket. My old cell phone. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out. A text message. My heart leaped into my throat. I opened it. It contained a single word from a number I recognized as Dave's. Tuesday. Tuesday, that was tomorrow. My mind raced, trying to decipher the cryptic message. What did it mean? Were they coming on Tuesday? Was I supposed to do something? I had no way of knowing, but it didn't matter. It was a signal. It was the first sign from the outside world, a confirmation that my letter had been received, that I was no longer alone in this fight. Hope, real and powerful, surged through me. I quickly deleted the message, my thumb shaking, just as I heard the water in the shower shut off. The rest of that day and through the long night, the air in the house was as heavy as lead. Mark was almost completely silent. He just sat, watching me with a strange new expression in his eyes. It wasn't contempt anymore. It was a watchful, calculating look, tinged with something I had never seen there before. Fear. I knew then that he knew. He didn't know what I had done or how, but he knew the game had changed. He knew that the prey was no longer helpless, and that feeling, the silent seismic shift of power in that quiet house, was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing I had ever felt. I just had to survive until Tuesday. When I woke on Tuesday morning, the world felt different. The air in the house was thick, heavy, and unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. I could tell Mark felt it too. He didn't make his usual trip for coffee. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, listlessly stirring a cup that had long gone cold, his gaze fixed on the front window. We were both waiting. but only I knew what for. I tried to read a book on the Civil War, a subject that normally captivated me, but the words were just black marks on a page. My eyes scanned the lines, but my mind absorbed nothing. Every one of my senses was tuned to the outside world, straining to catch a sign. The sound of a passing car, the bark of a neighbor's dog, each noise made me jump, my nerves stretched as taut as a violin string. And then it came. It wasn't the polite chime of the doorbell. It was a knock. 3 hard, authoritative raps on the solid oak door that shook the quiet of the house. Bam, bam, bam. The sound was so concussive, so final, that Mark physically jolted, splashing the cold coffee across the table. He whipped his head around to look at me, his eyes wide with a wild, panicked confusion. "Who is that?" he whispered, as if I held the answer to a question he was too afraid to ask himself. I said nothing. I just sat there, my book resting in my lap, and waited. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Police! Open the door!" The voice was a clear, commanding baritone that cut straight through the wood, straight through the tension, and into the very heart of the room. In that single, suspended moment, everything seemed to stop. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the ragged sound of Mark's breathing, even the frantic beating of my own heart. The world held its breath with us. Justice had arrived. Mark stumbled to his feet, knocking his chair over as he went. He moved like a man in a trance, his legs unsteady as he made his way to the door. He turned the handle and pulled it open. Standing on the porch were 2 police officers, their broad shoulders filling the doorway, their presence an undeniable statement of authority. And standing just behind them, in a simple business suit, was a woman. I knew her immediately. It was Maria from the bank. She met my gaze from across the room and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod that said, "I heard you. We're here. It's over." One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Mark. He began to recite the words I had heard 100 times in movies and on television, but hearing them in my own living room, directed at my own son, was profoundly surreal. "You have the right to remain silent." Mark didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the color draining from his face until it was a ghastly, pasty white. All the aggression, all the cruelty, all the power he had wielded over me in this very house evaporated in an instant. All that was left was a small, frightened man, exposed and broken. As they put the handcuffs on him, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence, he turned his head and looked at me one last time. It wasn't a look of remorse or regret. It was a look of pure, uncomprehending disbelief mixed with a bitter poison of resentment. It was the look of a man who couldn't fathom how this had happened. How could I, the frail old man he had so easily controlled, the man he had stripped of everything, have orchestrated his downfall? He had underestimated me. He had forgotten that a librarian's entire life is dedicated to a few simple principles: to finding the truth amidst the noise, to bringing order to chaos, and to understanding that every story, no matter how dark, must eventually have an ending. In his eyes, I no longer saw my son. I saw a stranger who had played a vicious game and had just lost. After they led him away, the house fell into a silence unlike any I had ever known. It wasn't the tense, watchful silence of the past few months. It was a deep, peaceful quiet. The tension had vanished from the air. The fear was gone. It was just me and the steady, comforting tick-tock of the clock. Maria and Dave, who had been waiting patiently in his car and had come in with the police, walked over to me. Maria placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "It's over now, Mr. Miller. she said softly. Her voice was an anchor in the swirl of my emotions. Dave didn't say much. He just walked into the kitchen, my kitchen, and started making a pot of tea the way he always used to. It was the most normal, most beautiful thing I had seen in a very long time. I sat in my recliner, listening to them talk in low, reassuring tones about the next steps, about lawyers and bank accounts and legal proceedings. My mind heard the words, but my soul was somewhere else. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt safe. I felt like I was finally home. Dave brought me a steaming mug of English breakfast tea. The familiar, fragrant steam rose up to meet me. I closed my eyes and took a deep, long breath, pulling the scent into my lungs. It felt like the first real breath I had taken since the day I fell. The first breath of freedom. I opened my eyes and looked around my living room, at my books, my recliner, the photograph of Eleanor on the mantel. They were all still here. They had been silent witnesses to the whole ugly affair. They had waited patiently for my return. The war was over. I had survived. But I knew, looking at the invisible scars all around me, that the journey to heal had only just begun. But at least, now, I didn't have to walk it alone. The following morning, I woke up feeling as though I had truly slept for the first time in months. It was a deep, dreamless rest that had reset something fundamental within me. The sunlight streaming through the bedroom window no longer felt like an accusation, a harsh spotlight on my confinement. Instead, it was warm and gentle, a quiet invitation to a new day. I was able to make my own way down to the kitchen, my hip still aching but manageable. I brewed my own coffee. The simple, familiar ritual, scooping the grounds, the gurgle of the machine, the rich aroma filling the air, felt like a miracle. Each small act was a reclamation of a life that had been stolen from me. Dave had stayed the night on the sofa, a silent guardian angel in a worn-out VFW sweatshirt. He didn't say much, but his quiet presence was more comforting than any words could have been. Just knowing he was there, a steady and loyal friend, was an anchor. Maria called early, her voice a reassuring blend of professionalism and genuine warmth. She informed me that the bank had frozen all the accounts, and their legal team was already initiating the process to challenge the fraudulent transactions. Wheels were turning. Things were happening. Not by me, but for me. It was a profound shift. I was no longer the sole secret engine of my own salvation. I now had allies. There was so much to do, a mountain of logistical debris to clear away. Dave, with the practical efficiency of a man who had seen far worse messes, helped me arrange for a technician to come and reconnect the phone line. The first call I made was to my health insurance provider. I explained the situation, my voice steady, and the woman on the other end of the line was incredibly understanding. Hearing her say, "We'll get this sorted out for you, Mr. Miller. We're reinstating your policy immediately," felt like a massive weight being lifted off my chest. My safety net was being rewoven, thread by thread. Next, I called the lawyer Maria had recommended. With each conversation, I felt a piece of my old self returning. It was like reshelving books that had been knocked to the floor in a chaotic heap. I was restoring order, one call at a time, and I wasn't doing it alone. Dave sat with me, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, his quiet competence a source of immense strength. I realized then that even in my deepest isolation, I had never truly been alone. The connections I had built over a lifetime were still there, waiting. In life, we all need our trusted experts, not just lawyers or doctors, but maybe a reliable mechanic or a dedicated bank teller. Who is the person you always turn to when you're in trouble? Share a story about your trusted expert in the comments. A few days later, I sat in a sterile conference room with my new lawyer and a financial advisor. They laid out the documents, the statements, the cold, hard facts of the devastation. Seeing it all there, in neat columns of black ink, was in some ways more painful than living through it. The numbers told a brutal story. More than half of my life savings were gone, siphoned off into anonymous accounts or squandered on frivolous things. The reverse mortgage on the house was a stark, ugly reality on paper. It was a gut punch. But as I stared at the damage report of my life, a strange thing happened. The despair I expected to feel never came. Instead, I was filled with a sense of profound clarity. The enemy was no longer a shadowy, shapeless dread. It had a name and a number. It wasn't Mark, it was chaos. And my job as a lifelong librarian was to put it back in order. I started with the house. It was more than just cleaning. It was an exorcism. The first thing to go was that monstrous television. I sold it for a fraction of what Mark had paid and felt a deep satisfaction watching two young men haul it out of my living room. Then I methodically went through every room, gathering up everything he had brought into the house, the gaudy decorations, the expensive gadgets. I packed them in boxes and donated them. I was purging his presence, his influence from my sanctuary. I scrubbed floors, polished furniture, and rearranged every book on my shelves until they were back in their perfect, logical order. The physical labor was therapeutic. With every item discarded, with every surface wiped clean, I felt a layer of grime being washed away from my soul. The house, after months of holding its breath, finally started to breathe again. And so did I. One afternoon, while I was tending to Eleanor's rose bushes in the front yard, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, came over carrying a freshly baked apple pie. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." We had lived next to each other for 20 years, our interactions mostly limited to polite waves and small talk over the fence. Her simple act of kindness, the warm weight of the pie dish in my hands, moved me more than I could say. It was a reminder that community still existed, that human decency was all around me, even when I'd been too lost in my own darkness to see it. I invited her in for a cup of tea. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sound of a guest's laughter filled my home. Later that night, I sat in my recliner in my clean, orderly house. The world was quiet. The storm had passed. Everything was safe. Everything was as it should be. But a question lingered in the peaceful silence, a persistent, uncomfortable thought. Mark, my son, I had won. Justice was being served. So why didn't I feel happy? Why wasn't there a sense of triumph? Instead, there was just a hollow ache in the center of my chest, a profound emptiness. I realized then that to truly move on, to truly heal, I had to face him one last time, not to forgive him, not to understand him, but to end the story. A few weeks passed, weeks filled with the quiet, methodical work of putting my life back together. Then, the phone rang. It was my lawyer. Mark wanted to see me. My immediate response was a flat, simple no. A part of me, the part that was just beginning to heal, wanted nothing more than to erase him, to excise him from my life like a tumor. I wanted to close the book on that chapter and never, ever open it again. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and the house was suddenly filled with ghosts. I saw him as a little boy, no older than 7, his face alight with wonder as I read him a story about knights and dragons. I felt the memory of his small hand in mine as we walked to the library on a crisp autumn afternoon. I could almost feel his weight on my shoulders as I carried him home after he'd fallen asleep at a town picnic. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that if I didn't go, if I didn't face him, a part of me would be trapped in that prison with him forever. The next morning, I called the lawyer back. I'll go. Dave drove me to the county correctional facility. We didn't speak a word the entire way. There was nothing to say. The silence was filled with the low hum of the engine and the blur of the world passing by outside the window. I watched houses and trees and families go by, small vignettes of normal life, and I kept asking myself the same impossible question: where did it all go wrong? How does a story that begins with bedtime stories and piggyback rides end here, on a quiet road leading to a place of concrete and razor wire? The visitation room was even colder than I had imagined. It was a sterile, soulless place, designed to strip away every last vestige of warmth and humanity. Everything was painted a flat, institutional gray: the concrete walls, the metal tables bolted to the floor, the hard plastic chairs. I sat down, the chairs cold seeping through my clothes, and waited. The air smelled of disinfectant, the same clean, impersonal scent from the hospital where my helplessness, my ordeal, had begun. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, Arthur Miller, a man who had lived his entire life by the rules, who had never so much as had an overdue library book, sitting in a jail, waiting for the son who had tried to destroy me. I wondered if any of the books in my library contained a chapter that could explain this feeling. Probably not. Some stories, I was learning, you have to live through to understand. Then a door buzzed open, and he walked in, flanked by a guard. He was wearing a faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He looked thin, depleted, and had aged a decade in a matter of weeks. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He sat down opposite me, and a thick pane of plexiglass separated us, a clear, solid barrier that was a perfect metaphor for the chasm between us. He picked up the black telephone receiver on his side. I mirrored the action, the plastic cool and foreign in my hand. He started talking immediately, a torrent of words tumbling out. Excuses, apologies, explanations about the debt, the threats, the desperation that had cornered him. He spoke of his fear, of his mistakes, of how he never meant for things to go so far. I just sat there and listened, my expression unchanged. His voice, tinny and distant through the receiver, was filled with a pathetic, self-serving sorrow. But I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, not even a flicker of the old love. His words were just sounds, empty and meaningless, like torn pages from a book I no longer had any interest in reading. The story they told was about him, and I was done with his story. When he finally ran out of words, a long, heavy silence stretched between us. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, waiting for something, absolution, perhaps, forgiveness, but I didn't have any of that left to give. "Mark," I said, and my own voice sounded calm and steady, a stranger to the turmoil I had lived through. "You didn't just take my money, you took my trust, and that's something you can't pay back." I leaned a little closer to the glass, wanting him to see that I was no longer the broken man from the hospital. "The legacy I wanted to leave you wasn't in a bank account. It was the idea that a man's worth is in his integrity, in his honor, that a man who has those things is richer than anyone. That was the most important lesson, and it was the one I failed to teach you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply stated the truth as I saw it, and in that truth I felt a profound, bottomless sadness. A sadness for both of us, for the father and son we once were, and for everything we had lost." I placed the receiver back in its cradle, a small, definitive click. The conversation was over. He stared at me through the glass, his mouth slightly open as if to say something more, but no words came. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My legs were a little unsteady, but I made sure my back was straight. I turned around and walked toward the exit. I did not look back. With every step I took away from that gray room, I could feel an immense, invisible weight lifting from my shoulders. I didn't know what his future held, and for the first time, I realized I no longer cared. From this moment on, his story was his own to write. When I stepped outside, the bright afternoon sun was blinding. Dave was waiting by the car, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask a single question. He just opened the passenger door for me. As we drove away, I watched the squat gray building recede in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a speck, and then it was gone. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt free. It was like finishing a very long, very sad book. And now, finally, I was ready to pick up a new one, a book with a fresh start. It took a long time, a season of slow, quiet days turning into weeks and then months. But gradually, a new kind of order began to settle over my life. The legal process was a slow-moving glacier, a tedious landscape of paperwork and phone calls. Not all the money could be recovered. Some of it was simply gone, vanished into the ether of bad decisions and desperate choices. But the house was safe. My home was secure. And I learned to live with this new reality. I was no longer a wealthy man by the world's standards, but I had enough. And more importantly, I had peace. I found a new rhythm for my days. Each morning, I would take a slow walk, my hips still protesting but growing stronger, down to a small cafe at the end of my street. I'd sit with a black coffee and the morning paper, and I'd say hello to my neighbors as they passed by. Simple, ordinary things. But they felt extraordinary. I began to realize that my world was larger than the four walls of my study, larger than the pages of my books. It was filled with the morning sun, the smell of brewing coffee, and the easy smiles of people I was finally taking the time to know. One day, I got a call from my old library. They were reorganizing the historical archives and needed volunteers. I said yes without a moment's hesitation. Walking back into that building, being enveloped by the familiar, comforting scent of old paper and binding glue, felt like coming home. The hushed reverence of the space was a balm to my soul, but this time it was different. I was no longer the head librarian, the man in charge. I was just a volunteer, a helper, and I loved it. There was no pressure, no great responsibility. There was only the pure, simple joy of being with my old silent friends, the books, of feeling the weight of them in my hands, of tracing the gold leaf on a worn-out spine. It was a connection to the best parts of my past without the burden of the worst. While volunteering, I started talking to the other seniors who spent their days there. I listened to their stories, their worries, about navigating online banking, about trusting their children with financial matters, about the constant fear of scams. Our quiet conversations in the dusty archives became a small circle of shared anxieties. One afternoon, the library director, a kind young woman named Sarah, approached me. "Arthur," she said, "you have so much experience. Would you ever consider giving a little talk, just sharing what you've learned?" The thought terrified me. To stand in front of a crowd and speak about the most painful chapter of my life felt impossible. It was one thing to fight a silent battle, but another to expose my wounds to the world. But then I looked at the faces around me in the library that afternoon, the silver hair, the reading glasses, the eyes that held a lifetime of stories, and a hint of the same vulnerability I knew so well, and I knew I had to do it. That first talk changed everything. I stood at a small lectern, my hands trembling, and I simply told my story. I didn't use big words or dramatic flourishes, I just spoke the truth. Afterward, people didn't just thank me. They came up to me one by one with their own stories, their own fears, and then they started asking for my help. "Mr. Miller, could you look at this email for me? It says I won a lottery. Arthur, my son wants me to sign this paper. Can you help me understand it? Can you show me how to install one of those security programs on my computer? I became a librarian again, but my library was no longer just filled with books. My patrons were my peers, and the information I helped them navigate wasn't history or literature, but the treacherous, complex forest of the modern world. I was helping them read the fine print of life. I had found a new purpose, a purpose that had grown directly from the soil of my own suffering. My pain had become my expertise. My scars had become my credentials. One evening, as I was preparing notes for another library talk, Dave stopped by. He was holding a small, unassuming cardboard box. "The police recovered this from a pawn shop downtown," he said, placing it on the table. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was my Omega Seamaster, Eleanor's watch. The crystal was slightly scratched, a small blemish on its otherwise perfect face, but it was still ticking, its second hand sweeping in a steady, determined circle. I took it out and fastened it around my wrist. The familiar weight, the cool touch of the metal against my skin. It was a profound moment. The watch was no longer a painful symbol of a past that had been stolen. It was a testament to what I had survived. It was proof that even after time is lost, it can be reclaimed. Its steady ticking was a reminder that life, no matter what, goes on. I still live in my house. I still sit in my old recliner in the evenings. But now, when I look out at the garden where Eleanor planted her roses, I don't just see what I've lost. I see a whole life, a life with chapters of deep sorrow and pages that were torn and frayed. But that wasn't the whole story. My story didn't end with betrayal. It ends with resilience. It ends with friendship. It ends with the quiet, steady light of truth. And that, I've come to understand, is the real legacy. That is the book I want to leave on the shelf. And that brings us to today, to this moment right here. I know that when we men, who've seen more than a few decades, sit down together, the stories just start to flow. Today, I've opened my heart a little, and now I'm hoping I can hear some of your stories in return. You know, sometimes just a simple click, a like, a subscribe, or a share might seem like a small, fleeting gesture to many. But for me and for all the quiet voices out there that need to be heard, every single one of those clicks is a light in the darkness. It says, I see you, I hear you, your story matters. Now that I've shared my story, what I'd like most is to hear yours. In the comments below, I would be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt overlooked or that your voice wasn't being heard? Do you have a passion or a hobby that others might have dismissed as silly? Or maybe a moment when you found your own strength quietly and without fanfare? Please, share. I will read every one, and I'll carry them with me because your stories are important. WAWA. Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. And if you don't have a hardship to share today, then tell me about a small joy. What made you smile today? If you're watching this on a television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and find my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's build this place together, a community where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me. It means more than you know.